Hello everyone, my name is Triple S and welcome to Going Through Game of Thrones. In this video I'll be talking about the 6th episode of the first season of Game of Thrones titled A Golden Crown. I'll be going through the plot of the episode, giving my thoughts, praise, criticisms and the like throughout, and there may also be references to future episodes which could be spoilery, so you've been warned. If I end up getting something factually wrong, if you disagree with any of my thoughts or opinions, just leave a good-natured comment below letting me know. Don't go flying off the handle, please. Also, don't forget to like, subscribe and ring that bell to be notified when I release new review videos going forward. With that said, let's begin. After the opening credits showing us King's Landing, the Eyrie, Winterfell, the Wall and Vaes Dothrak, Ned awakens to find Cersei and Robert standing at the foot of his bed. Sean Bean, having the flu whilst filming this episode, helped to get across how feverish Ned is from the wound he sustained in the last episode, and he apologises to Robert for not being able to rise because of it. Cersei asks if Ned knows what his wife has done, and he lies that Cat captured Tyrion at his command. She demands to know by what right did he believe he could lay hands on her brother, and he says he is the King's Hand. They shout over each other, Cersei arguing that he was the King's Hand but will now be held accountable for his crimes, and Ned arguing that as the King's Hand he is charged with keeping the King's peace and has the power to enforce the King's justice before they're cut off by Robert, shouting at them both to shut their mouths. Robert tells Ned to get Cat to release Tyrion and make his peace with Jaime, but Ned argues Jaime killed his men. Well, technically he only killed Jory, though he did give the order to have them all killed, so I guess it makes sense to lay all the blame on him. Cersei then spins a tale of Ned and his men stumbling drunk out of a brothel and picking a fight with Jaime. I mean, you got 1 out of 3 right there, Cersei. He was in a brothel, but I don't know how you expected Robert to believe Ned was day drunk and looking for a fight with the Kingslayer. In the book, Robert does bring up that Littlefinger confirmed Ned had been in a whorehouse, but Ned tells him he was there to see the whore, Megan, and her daughter Barra, mentioning that Barra is Robert's bastard daughter in the hope of getting some kind of reaction from Cersei. Also in the book, it says Ned has been passed out in bed for 6 days and 7 nights, and upon waking up learns from Alan, Jorah's replacement as captain of his guard, of Jaime's flight to presumably join his father Tywin at Casterly Rock, home of House Lannister. This explains how in the show Ned knows of Jaime's flight despite appearing to have only just woken up, and also explains why Cersei and Robert were there when he awoke. I mean, it wouldn't make sense to be standing over his bed waiting for him to regain consciousness, it's just Ned had previously been awake, the King and Queen were informed, and in the time it took them to get to his room, he'd briefly fallen back asleep. Ned asks for Robert's permission to bring Jaime back to King's Landing to face justice, but Robert doesn't answer. Cersei says she took Robert for a king, and ignoring his command to be quiet, she tells him one of her brothers was attacked and the other abducted, and that she should be the one to wear armour, and Robert a gown. Slightly different phrasing than what she says in the book, and the slap Robert gives her is also different. A palm slap in the show but a backhand in the book that sends her falling to the floor. In both the book and the show though, she says she will wear the mark the strike will leave as a badge of honour, and Robert tells her to wear it in silence or he will honour her again. Cersei and Ned glare at each other for a moment before she hurries from the room, leaving Robert to say it was her own fault that he hit her, but then admits that he shouldn't have done it as it wasn't very kingly of him. Yep, acting just as kingly as Viserys with slapping defenseless women there, Bob. Dany was able to threaten her brother into never hitting her again, but Robert had best get himself a food taster, as instead of threatening her husband, Cersei might resort to other methods to make sure he never smacks her again. Ned says he and Robert must act or there will be war, and Robert tells him to send a raven to Cat, ordering her to release Tyrion to make sure that war doesn't happen. Ned asks what about Jaime, and Robert says he's massively in debt to Tywin and that he doesn't want to know what's happened between the Starks and the Lannisters, but that he can't rule the Seven Kingdoms if the Wolf and the Lion are at each other's throats, so their quarrel must end now. Ned relents and says he will head back to Winterfell ASAP to set things straight, but Robert tells him no, he'll send a raven instead as he wants Ned to stay, and as king, he gets what he wants. Taking a swig of wine, he reveals he never loved his actual brothers, which is a sad but true thing for him to admit, but instead he chose Ned to love as a brother. With that, he throws Ned the brooch at the hand of the king and says he's going out on a hunt, as killing things helps clear his head. He chuckles that Ned's going to have to sit on the throne whilst he's away and will hate it more than he does. As he goes to leave, Ned mentions Dany, which angers him. He puts his foot down that Dany will die and says he doesn't want to hear any more about it, then tells Ned to put on the hand's brooch, threatening that if he takes it off again he'll pin it on Jaime. Speaking of Dany, we cut to her in a tent holding one of her dragon eggs, and before I carry on I just want to say during the time I was making my going through video for The Matrix Resurrections, link in the top right if you want to check it out, I finally got around to reading Fire and Blood, where I learned some potentially revealing information about the true origins of Dany's dragon eggs. Though Illyrio, upon gifting them to her, claims that they are from the Shadowlands beyond Ashai, in Fire and Blood a specific mention is made of 3 dragon eggs. In 54 AC, AC standing for after the conquest of Westeros by Aegon Targaryen First, a woman named Alyssa Farman stole 3 dragon eggs when she departed from Dragonstone. Alyssa took the eggs to Essos and sold them to the Sea Lord of Bravos for a significant amount of gold, which she then used to have a ship called the Sun Chaser built and to hire a crew so that she could sail west of Westeros in an attempt to discover new lands and riches. King Jaehaerys Targaryen I feared the hatching of these eggs and the rise of dragon lords in the east north of House Targaryen, but Grand Maester Bennifer believed the eggs may not hatch away from the heat of Dragonstone and would eventually just turn to stone. The belief that these 3 stolen eggs are the same as the ones in Dany's possession is just a theory at the time of me writing this, with the biggest issue people have with it being how did Illyrio come to be in possession of them? Dragon eggs are expensive, they argue, when it's really dragon eggs that could still potentially hatch that are expensive. At the time of the theft, King Jaehaerys believed selling all 3 would get you enough gold to buy an entire fleet of ships, but in this episode we soon learn that Viserys believes with all 3 he would only be able to buy 1 ship and a large army on the side. Which to me makes more sense, they're just lumps of rock now, fossilised with no hope of hatching any dragons, which greatly depreciates their value, and a wealthy man such as Illyrio would be easily able to afford such antiques. If indeed he bought them at all, let's not forget they could just as easily have been stolen. If Dany's eggs are the same as the 3 stolen from Dragonstone over 2 centuries ago, the first book and presumably the first season of the show takes place in 298 AC, then Grand Maester Bennifer's prediction that they would not hatch but instead turn to stone was correct, and no matter how long you leave that egg on that brazier, Dany, it ain't ever gonna hatch. Irri appears in the doorway and cautiously calls to Dany, then freaks out as Dany grabs the egg from the fire. She rushes forward and snatches the egg out of Dany's hands, dropping it as it burns her own. Inspecting Dany's hands, she finds no burns whatsoever and looks at her confused. Dany looks at Irri's hands and says she's hurt as there are dragon egg scale burn marks burned onto her palms. There's the hot bath, and now this. I'm starting to think something weird is going on here. Speaking of weird things, Bran's having the same weird 3-eyed raven, his legs work, Winterfell crypt dream from the 4th episode again, before being awoken suddenly by a beardless Hodor barging into his room and laughing happily as Hodor shows him his brand new saddle made from the plans Tyrion gave him. Cut then to Bran in that saddle, on his horse, Dancer, having a jolly old ride around in circles around Theon and Robb, who are sat having a chat about what's happened down in King's Landing. Theon asks when Robb will tell Bran and he answers not now, so Bran won't be a part of this conversation like he is in the book. Theon tells Robb he needs to make the Lannisters pay for the deaths of Jory, Heward and Will, and says he's talking about justice when Robb says he's talking about war. Robb points out only the Lord of Winterfell can call in the Stark's bannermen, and his father is Lord of Winterfell, not him, but Theon says a Lannister soldier put a spear through Ned's leg and that Jaime's heading for the protection of Casterly Rock. Robb interrupts, asking incredulously if Theon wants him to march a northern army almost 2,000 miles south to lay siege to Casterly Rock, to which Theon argues they're at war. A war the Lannisters started when they attacked Ned, and Robb, no longer a boy, must do his duty in representing House Stark whilst his father is stuck in King's Landing. Robb makes it clear though that while it may be his duty, it's not Theon's, as it is not his house, shocking Theon. He then notices he can no longer hear Bran and stands to look around, only to find his brother gone, ridden off whilst he and Theon argued. Points out Bran's disappearance to Theon, asking him where he has gone. Theon stands and looks around but says he doesn't know as it is not his house, then walks away. Riding through the woods, Bran is snuck upon by 4 ragged looking people, 3 men and 1 woman who grabs hold of Dancer's bridle. The wildling woman, Osha, comments on Bran being all alone but he corrects her that his brother is with him. This Night's Watch deserter, Stiv, says he doesn't see the brother unless he's hidden under Bran's cloak and demands Bran's silver pin when Osha points it out and his horse as well. He tells Bran to get off his horse and grows impatient when he doesn't move, but Bran points out he can't because he's strapped into the saddle. Stiv asks him if he's a cripple and Bran angrily shouts he's Brandon Stark of Winterfell and will have them all killed if they don't leave him alone. Stiv starts cutting the straps with a knife as one of the other men, Wallen, suggests they cut off Bran's John Thomas as they stuff it into his mouth to shut him up. Osha argues Bran would be worth nothing dead and wonders what Mance Rayder would give them if they brought him one of Benjen Stark's family. Stiv, having caught Bran's leg with his knife, finishes cutting the straps and tells Osha to urinate on Mance Rayder and on the north, that they're going to go all the way to White Walker Free Dawn in the south. Despite this maybe wildling, maybe Night's Watch deserter looking in the direction he appears from, Robb somehow sneaks up on them and draws his sword as he tells Stiv he'll let them all live if he drops his knife and lets Bran go. Show Robb is a lot more forgiving than Book Robb, who promises the 4 wildlings and 2 Night's Watch deserters a quick and painless death if they surrender their weapons. Yep, Robb in the book is outnumbered 6-1 compared to 4-1 in the show, though in the book he's on his horse and is joined by Summer and Greywind, evening the odds. Stiv orders Wallen to attack Rob, but he isn't that great of a fighter and gets his throat slashed open in short order. Rob might need to go back to fighting school himself, since he seems to have forgotten one of the most important rules: never turn your back on an enemy. If Osha in the show had been armed with a spear like she is in the book, instead of a hammer, then Rob would have been skewered, not just madly inconvenienced when she whacks him on the back. Should have gone for the head, Osha. He knocks the hammer from her hands with his sword, grabs her by her hair and forces her to her knees, then literally single-handedly takes down the charging maybe wildling, maybe Night's Watch deserter with several stabs. Throughout all this, Stiv dragged Bran from his saddle and, now holding a knife to his throat, orders Rob to drop his sword. Bran tells him not to, but Rob, still holding Osha by her hair, places his sword on the ground. Suddenly an arrow bursts from Stiv's chest, and dying, he drops Bran and his knife and falls to the ground to reveal Theon holding a bow behind him. Theon reloads his bow and aims at Osha as Rob lets go of her to pick up Bran, who says the cut on his leg doesn't hurt. Theon calls Bran a tough little lad and congratulates Rob in becoming a man by Iron Island rules of needing to kill an enemy first. Not so happy Rob, though, admonishes Theon for risking Bran's life, only saying in the show what if he'd missed, but going further in the book with also what if the arrow only just wounded Stiv? What if being hit by the arrow had caused Stiv's knife hand to jump and stab Bran? What if the arrow going through Stiv had then gone into Bran? What if Stiv had turned out to be wearing plate armour under his cloak and it blocked the arrow? Theon argues Stiv would have killed Rob and cut Bran's throat, and when Rob starts to say he had no right, Theon interrupts that he had the right to save Bran because it was the only thing he could do, so he did it. Looking at Osha, Rob wonders what they should do with her, and after she says she'll be his if he spares her life, he allows her to live. Just to question her, mind you. Sorry, Osha shippers. In a sky cell of the Eyrie in the Vale of Arryn, a sleeping Tyrion rolls over and wakes up to find himself right on the edge of his cell, facing down at the ground, very far down below him. Now wide awake, he beats on the cell door, calling for the turnkey Maud, who charges in, whacking Tyrion and driving him to the opposite corner, close to falling out of the cell. Maud seems like he may have some form of mental disability, whether he was born that way, or the axe strike that gave him his scar also affected his mind, we'll never know, but it does mean he doesn't quite understand Tyrion when he says he's prepared to give Maud lots of gold. Maud gives Tyrion a quick body search and says there's no gold. Tyrion says he has gold, but not on him right now, but Maud just whacks him again, repeating there's no gold, and adds fuck off as he leaves the cell and leaves Tyrion clutching his arm in pain. Real pain, since during filming Peter Dinklage wore no padding on his arm, so all those hits from Kettering Birmingham left Peter with bruises. At King's Landing, Arya and Syrio prepare to practice when she says she doesn't want to because Jory is dead and her father is hurt. He asks her if she is troubled, and when she answers yes, he smacks her around with his sword, telling her the best time to train is when you are troubled. He says dancing in the meadow, running through a field of wheat and playing with dolls and kittens isn't when fighting happens, and when she starts to say she doesn't like dolls and kittens, he smacks her other arm, interrupting her. He tells her she is not in the moment, she's thinking about her troubles, and says if she's with her troubles whilst in a fight, then it will be more trouble for her, as he whacks her arm again, and she fights back, but is easily tripped over backwards. As she lies on the floor, he asks how can she be quick as a snake as he strikes at her. Then, how can she be as quiet as a shadow as she stands and advances on him, before finishing when her mind's somewhere else, and as he grabs her sword from her hand and places it and his own at her neck. He lowers the sword, puts his hand on her shoulder and asks if she's afraid for her father, and if she prays to the gods. She answers she is afraid, and that she prays both to the nameless old gods of the north and to the new gods of the faith of the Seven of the south. Syrio, though, says there is only one god, the god of death, so the stranger of the seven then? And there is only one thing you say to death. Not today. One of the most popular and quoted lines, and it's an original creation for the show. It's not from the books at all. This seems to have cheered Arya up. She catches the sword Syrio throws to her, and the dancing lesson begins. In a large tent in Vestofrak, a crowd watches as Dany, in the centre and covered in blood, slowly eats her way through a massive horse's heart. A Dosh Khaleen, a former Khaleesi, chants as Dany bites, chews and swallows, gazing into Drogo's eyes for the strength to keep from throwing up. Viserys asks Jorah if she has to eat the whole heart and hopes it didn't come from his horse. Jorah notes she's doing well, but Viserys doesn't believe she'll be able to keep it down. As she rips a piece from the heart and Drogo nods in approval, Viserys tells Jorah to translate what the Dosh Khaleen is chanting. Prince is riding. I have heard the thunder of his hooves. Swift as the wind he rides. His enemies will cower before him, and their wives will weep tears of blood. Jorah translates, adding Dany's going to have a bouncing baby boy. Viserys is in denial though that the child will be a true Targaryen, a true dragon. Trying to swallow the last of the heart, Dany seems to retch and falls forward with a hand over her mouth. The tent falls silent and Drogo leans forward concerned. If she's actually thrown up in her mouth, which she doesn't do in the book I might add, she really shouldn't have, as the child could end up being born stillborn, weak, deformed, or worst of all, female. After composing herself for a few moments as everyone stares at her concerned, she finally straightens, swallows the last of the heart and smiles at Drogo, who smiles back. The Dosh Khaleen begin chanting again, and Jorah translates it as the stallion who mounts the world. He explains to Viserys that the stallion is the Khal of Khals, who unite all the Dothraki Khalasars into one and enslave the entire world. Dany stands and the crowd goes silent. She announces in Dothraki that a prince rides inside of her, and he will be called Rhaego, after her brother Rhaegar and her husband Drogo. A chant of Rhaego starts and Viserys looks around at the crowd, at all their smiles and excitement, and finally realises that they love his sister. As Drogo picks up Dany and parades her around the tent, Jorah says she's truly a queen today, but realises he has said it to himself as he notices Viserys is no longer standing beside him. He finds him with a sword around his waist, in Dany's tent, putting her dragon eggs into a bag. Warns him not to be seen carrying a sword, what with the law that those who carry a weapon or spill blood in Vaes Dothrak will be put to death, but Viserys argues it isn't his law. Jorah tells him the eggs don't belong to him, and that perhaps once it was true that whatever belonged to Dany also belonged to him, but not anymore. Here we have the moment where Viserys believes that if he sold all 3 of the eggs, he could buy himself a ship and a large army, and he goes on to say since he was 5 years old, he's been the last hope of restoring the greatest dynasty ever to have existed. The love the Dothraki have for Dany he has never had from anyone, and how can he restore House Targaryen to its former glory without love, fear, or wealth? Walking up to Jorah, he mocks him for his apparent nobility and honour in standing up to him and standing up for Dany, but he knows the real reason for why Jorah is doing this. He wants Dany. And he says he can have the Queen of the Savages as he calls her, he doesn't care, and he will step aside and let him leave. Jorah does the opposite and steps in front of Viserys, saying he can go, but not with the eggs. Viserys reminds him that he swore an oath and asks if loyalty means nothing to him. This seems to sting Jorah a little, who says loyalty means everything to him, but Viserys points out here he stands in contradiction to that. Jorah declares here he stands, not a contradiction, but a recontextualization. His oath and loyalty is no longer to Viserys, but to Dany, someone more deserving of it. With that, Viserys drops the bag of eggs, and Jorah moves aside to allow him to leave the tent. Apparently, according to Westeros.org, the words of House Mormont are, here we stand. No idea if the whole thing of Viserys and Jorah saying here he stands is a reference to that. Like, why would Viserys care to know Jorah's house words? Back with Tyrion in his cell, he shouts for Maud and kicks on the door until it is flung open and he's knocked to the ground by an angry Maud. He mentions gold and gets a whack from Maud and starts to say how possession is an abstract concept and gets another whack for using long and confusing words that Maud doesn't understand. He explains when he was captured his gold was taken from him. Maud demands to know where it is, and when Tyrion starts to say he doesn't know but when he gets free, only to get another whack and he's told to be free by jumping out of the open wall of the cell. It makes me wonder if anyone's attempted to escape by crafting a makeshift parachute out of their clothes. Tyrion asks Maud if he's ever heard of the phrase rich as a Lannister, and Maud's face changes with interest. He calls Maud a smart man for knowing who the Lannisters are and tells him that he is Tyrion, son of Tywin, a Lannister. He goes on to say that he must have also heard the phrase a Lannister always pays his debts, and that if he delivers the message to Lysa Arryn for him, then he will be in Maud's debt and owe him gold. Maud, now fully understanding what Tyrion has been trying to tell him, asks what message. Tyrion stands and asks Maud to tell Lysa that he wishes to confess to his crimes. Cut to him in the High Hall, stood before an assembled crowd, and Lysa and Robin sat in the weirwood throne with Cat stood next to them. Lysa asks Tyrion if he wishes to confess his crimes, and he answers he does. She tells Cat the Sky Cells always break their occupants and orders Tyrion to speak. Oh, you're going to regret that. Starts off vague, admitting he is a vile man and has lied, cheated, gambled and whored, and though he's not so great at violence, he's able to convince others to do violence for him. He says all this in the most fake apologetic tone I've ever heard. He then goes into specifics. When he was 7, he stole the clothes of a girl bathing in a river and says he can still see her tits bouncing as she returned to the castle crying. This elicits gasps from the crowd and a look from Lysa. His next confession is how at age 10 he stuffed his uncle's boots with goat shit and blamed it on a squire who was flogged. Most likely he's referring to Kevin, as Tyrion has 3 uncles, Kevin, Tyjet and Geryon, but in A Clash of Kings says Tyjet was always kind to him, and in A Storm of Swords says Geryon, or Uncle Gary as he refers to him, was the uncle he liked best. That is if there's any truth to this confession at all. He then shocks and amuses the crowd with a very outrageous confession. At the age of 12, he milked his eel, flogged his one-eyed snake, skinned his sausage, made his bald man cry into a pot of turtle stew, shaking his hand to simulate the action, causing Lysa to look away angrily and Cat to close her eyes exasperated. He adds he believes his sister ate the stew, or at least hopes she did, and starts to recount how he brought a jackass and a honeycomb into a brothel when Lysa jumps up and shouts for silence. Though Robin asks what happened next, she demands to know what Tyrion is doing, and he answers he's confessing his crimes. Cat tells him he has been brought before them to confess to the crimes of hiring someone to kill Bran and conspiring to murder Jon Arryn, but Tyrion apologises that he can't confess to those such crimes as he doesn't know anything about them. Fed up with him, Liza says she hopes he enjoyed his joke and tells Maud to this time put him in a smaller cell with a steeper floor. Tyrion addresses the crowd, asking if this is how justice is done in the Vale of Arryn. If someone denies the crimes they are accused of, just throw them in a cell and wait long enough for them to confess, even if they didn't do it. He says he is accused and so demands a trial. Liza seems to think for a moment, then tells him that if he is tried and found guilty then he will die, and he says he understands the law. He explains life is more elegant in the Vale. They don't have an executioner, instead they have the moon door, which he commands to be opened. In the book, the moon door is described as being an actual door made of weirwood, inscribed with a crescent moon, between two pillars that opens to the open sky. In the show, the moon door is this circle of metal in the floor which splits open before Tyrion as two men crank a wheel. And can I just say, what we see through the hole doesn't make sense to me at all. We see clouds, trees, and I think the start of the slope of the mountain, but if that's the case, where the hell is the high hall sticking out of the mountain to make this view possible? And even if it was sticking out of the mountain, it would have to stick out quite a way to be able to see the trees of the valley below through the moon door. The only way I could see it being possible is if the side of the mountain we don't see in the show is a straight 90 degrees, all the way to ground level, though even then the hall would have to stick out quite far. This whole redesign for the Eyrie is just terrible in my opinion. Liza says to Tyrion that if he wants a trial then they will hear giggling Robin's judgment, and then he will leave through either the main door or the moon door. Tyrion though says they don't need to bother Robin as he demands a trial by combat, getting laughs and murmurs from the crowd. The sisters aren't laughing however as they look at each other worried, and Liza admits Tyrion does have that right. At that, many of the knights of the Vale in the hall call out that they would be honoured to fight for her, exciting Robin who stands and shouts he wants the bad man to fly. Liza calls on Sir Vardis Egan, noting he's staying silent and asks if he doesn't want to avenge Jon Arryn. Vardis answers he does, but finds it shameful to kill a man half his size, which Tyrion agrees with. Liza reminds Tyrion that he demanded a trial by combat, and Tyrion answers he now demands the same right as her to name a champion. Vardis says he will gladly fight Tyrion's champion, but Tyrion tells him not to speak too soon because he names his brother Jaime as his champion. Liza points out Jaime is hundreds of miles away, and Tyrion answers if they send a raven he'd be happy to wait, but she's having none of it and declares the trial will be today. Tyrion amuses the crowd when he asks several times for a volunteer to be his champion, and Liza starts to say no one seems willing to fight for him when Bronn steps forward from the crowd and announces he will stand for Tyrion, shrugging in a why not way when Tyrion smiles at him incredulously. Heading back down south to the Kingswood, we see King Robert carrying a spear, his brother Renly also carrying a spear, Sir Barristan Selmy with his sword at his side, and Lancel Lannister carrying a skin of wine which he offers to Robert, who takes a swig. Robert reminisces that it was a simpler time when your enemy was right in front of you, wanting to be attacked. He points out though that Renly is too young to remember, but does get Selmy to agree with him. Renly unenthusiastically says it sounds exhilarating, making Robert laugh mockingly that it is not as exhilarating as the balls and masquerade parties Renly likes to throw, which irritates Renly. Robert asks Renly if he's ever had intercourse with a girl from the Riverlands, and he answers he thinks he did once. I'm going to press X to doubt, and I'm also going to press Y in surprise that Robert doesn't know or at least suspect that his brother bats for the other team. Robert tells Renly if he had he'd remember, and that back in his and Selmy's day you weren't a real man unless you'd made the beast with two backs with a girl from each of the Seven Kingdoms, presumably the North, the Iron Islands, the Vale of Arryn, the Westerlands, the Stormlands, the Reach, and Dawn, and also a girl from the Riverlands, a feat referred to as making the 8. Renly sarcastically comments that those 8 were lucky girls, and Selmy answers no when Robert asks him if he ever made the 8. Robert says those were the days, and at that Renly has just had enough with his big brother. He stops and angrily asks which days Robert is referring to, the days when millions died as one half of Westeros fought the other in Robert's rebellion, or the days before that when the Mad King listened to the voices in his head telling him to kill women and children, which I'll just point out isn't something that's ever mentioned to have happened in the books. Or the days long before that, when dragons were still alive and burned castles and kingdoms to the ground as they flew and danced through the sky. Robert tells him to be careful, and despite the fact they're brothers, Renly should remember he's still talking to his king. Not backing down, Renly says it must have been heroic during the war if you were drunk enough and had a Riverlands girl to disappoint in bed and make the 8 before stalking off back the way they came. Lancel takes this opportunity to offer Robert some more wine, and he takes several long big gulps as Selmy watches on concerned before thrusting the skin back at Lancel and marching off. Speaking of the Riverlands, in the Great Hall of the Red Keep of King's Landing, a group of people stand before Ned, who sat on the Iron Throne with Grand Maester Pycelle to his left and Peter Baelish to his right, as one of their number, a man called Joss, tells a horrible tale that has happened in the Riverlands. A band of men rode through, burning their fields, granaries and homes, raping and then murdering their women and covering their children in pitch to light on fire. Pycelle believes them to just be brigands, but Joss says they didn't steal anything, but in fact left something behind behind, addressing Ned as "Your Grace." Pycelle explains it's the hand of the king they're addressing as one of the other Riverlands men steps forward and upends a bag of dead fish onto the floor. The crowd groans, Pycelle winces, and both Ned and Peter seem taken aback. Peter says it's a sigil of House Tully and whispers to Ned, asking isn't Tully his wife Kat's house? Obviously they both know Kat was once a Tully before she married and became a star, but it appears Peter may be asking this in order to prompt Ned to ascertain whether it was Tully men or not who did the raiding. Though it wouldn't make much sense for Tully men to raid within their own lands, so if this bag of fish was left by the brigands in order to frame them, it was a pretty poor attempt. Either that, or it was meant to be intended as a threat. The sigil of House Tully is a fish, so dead fish equals dead Tullys, and Peter was just pointing this out to Ned in the form of an obvious question. And on top of all of this whole fish in a bag plot point isn't even a thing from the book, it's a new addition for the show. Ned asks if this band of men were flying a sigil, then suggests a banner when Joss looks confused. He answers he saw no sigil or banner, but he did see the largest man he's ever seen in his life cut a blacksmith in two and took a horse's head off with a single swing of his sword. Peter whispers to Ned how that sounds just like the mountain, and Ned says to Joss they are describing Sir Gregor Clegane. Way to make sure that it's 100% positively Gregor show by beating us over the head with how this large man cut a horse's head off, just like how Gregor almost did in the last episode. I guess he's been practicing to properly decapitate horses since then. In the book, the only description we get of the man leading these raiders is his monstrous size, and Pycelle even questions it being Gregor, pointing out there's plenty of large men throughout Westeros, but all the Riverlands knights there do not change their belief that it was the mountain. Pycelle is dubious as to why Gregor would do such a thing, as he is a knight, but Peter says he has heard him referred to as Tywin Lannister's mad dog, then whispers to Ned, asking him if he can think of any reason why the Lannisters would be mad at Kat. Yet another question which they both know the answer to. Pycelle says if the Lannisters, they being the overlords to House Clegane, had ordered these attacks on the Riverlands, then it would be, with Peter finishing for him, that it would be as brazen as attacking the Hand of the King within the walls of King's Landing. After sharing a look with Peter, Ned announces that he cannot restore their homes or bring their dead back to life. He ain't no necromancer, but he could bring them justice. At that, he calls forth Lord Beric Dondarrion and commands him to take 100 men to Gregor's Keep, located southeast of Lannisport in the Westerlands. Struggling to rise with the aid of a walking stick, he declares in the name of the king that Beric will go forth to bring the king's justice, aka an execution, to Gregor and all those he led in attacking the Riverlands. Ned then denounces and attaints Gregor. If you don't know what attaint means, he then explains it by next saying that Gregor is stripped of all of his rights, titles, lands and holdings and sentences him to death, shocking the crowd. Pycelle is also shocked and standing suggests maybe they should wait till Robert gets back before making a decision, but adding fuel to the fire, Ned orders him to send a raven to Tywin, ordering him to come to court to answer for Gregor's crimes or he will be branded an enemy of the crown. He then looks at Peter, nods to Beric, and as he descends the steps, Joss bows to him, then rejoins the other Riverlands men. Peter walks along with Ned as Pycelle watches them in despair and calls what Ned has just done a bold and admirable move, but wonders how wise it is to provoke Tywin, as he is the richest man in Westeros and that gold wins wars, not soldiers. Ned counters that if Tywin has so much gold, then how is it that Robert is king and not him? I mean, he used to be pretty much the king back when he was the Mad King's hand, you know, Ned? Back in the Eyrie, we see the moon door being opened again. I can only assume a fair amount of time has passed that they decided to close the door instead of just leaving it open. In fact, in the book, this would be the day after Tyrion requested a trial by combat. Bronn, lightly armoured, shakes his head when offered a shield, but a fully armoured Vardis accepts. As Tyrion and Kat watch on nervously, Robin shouts for them to fight. At first they approach and clash swords, but then Bronn starts giving ground, knocking aside Vardis' swings but not striking back himself. Going backwards up some steps, Bronn vaults the balustrade, Lysa shouts for Bronn to stand and fight, calling him a coward, getting an annoyed look from Tyrion. As Vardis descends the stairs, Bronn kicks a tall candelabra over at him, but he knocks it aside with his shield. Still backing up and dodging Vardis' sword, Bronn ends up right on the edge of the moon door, grappling with Vardis who's attempting to push him into it. He manages to push Vardis off of him, however, and they make their way behind some pillar. He shoves a nearby man into Vardis. They move back out from behind the pillars, and as Vardis slashes, he leaves himself open for to get past his shield and up close to slash him under his unprotected armpit. Lysa gasps and Tyrion shouts yes as he and Kat look at each other. Vardis raises his visor, panting, and Lysa goes all Mortal Kombat, shouting at him to finish him, as she glares at Tyrion, who glares back. Lowering his visor, Vardis goes on the attack again, but now quite tired and injured, his swings are wild and slow, and Bronn manages to get behind him to slash him behind the knee. Tyrion looks extremely happy as the crowd shouts for Vardis to stand. He manages to get back on his feet and charges at Bronn, only to be easily tripped and sent crashing to the floor. Bronn kicks away Vardis' shield, and when Vardis tries to swing at him, he grabs his sword arm, then raises his own sword. The crowd shouts in horror as Kat closes her eyes in resignation as Bronn drives his sword through a gap in Vardis' armour, down through his neck and into his chest. As blood gushes out of the wound, Bronn flings Vardis' corpse through the moon door to fall to the ground below, then looks to Tyrion, who bows his head at him, grinning. Robin asks if it's over, and Lysa angrily accuses Bronn of not fighting with honour. He agrees he didn't, but points out Vardis did. After being unshackled by Maud, Tyrion says he's going home when Robin asks him if he can make him fly now, then says to Rodrik that he has something of his. Rodrik looks for permission from Cat, who nods, then reluctantly tosses Tyrion his purse. Tyrion bows to Lysa, Robin and Cat, then as he and Bronn leave the hall, he throws the purse to Maud, saying a Lannister always pays his debts. The outcome of the duel is the same in the book, but the fight itself was a little different. Though still lightly armoured compared to Vardis, Bronn actually wore a half helmet. No reason not to, since it would impact his speed and agility and would give him more protection. He also didn't come out of the fight uninjured. A charge from Vardis caught him off guard, and his shield hit him in the face, busting his lip and breaking one of his teeth. Vardis also dies differently, with the moon door being an actual door in a wall and not a hole in the floor. His corpse isn't flung into it. Instead, Vardis is trapped under a statue that Bronn knocks over onto him, and is then stabbed not through the neck into his ribs, but under the arm into his ribs. Also, though Lysa has currently been bested by Tyrion, she still believes she will have the last laugh, and orders Tyrion and Bronn to be escorted from the Eyrie and sent out to travel through the Vale alone, with no protection against the wild and vicious hill tribesmen who will surely kill them for her. Under a pergola in King's Landing, Sansa Stark and Septa Mordane are knitting away. Septa Mordane comments on Sansa wearing her hair in the style of the South now, and Sansa says they're in the South, so why shouldn't she? Septa Mordane tells her though it's important to always remember where you came from, and says she isn't sure Cat would like these new Southern styles. Sansa points out her mother isn't from the North. Septa Mordane says she knows that, then asks why does Septa Mordane even care, and does she even have hair herself? Septa says she does, and asks if Sansa would like to see it, but she says no and asks where Septa Mordane is from. She starts to answer that she's from a very small village, but Sansa interrupts, saying she's just realised she doesn't actually care. Septa Mordane, annoyed, now tells Sansa she's being rude. Joffrey then enters, and the ladies stand and curtsy. Joffrey bows to Sansa and says he hasn't treated her very well lately, what with the whole ignoring her and the like, and presents her with a necklace and asks for her permission. Smiling, she turns around for him to put it around her neck, and looking at it, calls it beautiful and that it's like the one that Cersei wears. He says that she'll be queen someday, so she should look like one. Then asks if she'll forgive for how rude he's been acting. She answers that there isn't anything to forgive. He says one day they will be married in the throne room with lords and ladies from the north to the south of Westeros as witnesses, and Sansa will be queen over all of them. For some reason this makes Septa Mordane look kinda uncomfortable, and Joffrey continues that he will never treat Sansa badly again. Taking her face in his hands, he says the wedding vow lines, he is his lady from this day until his last, and they kiss. Ah, so romantic. And also apparently genuine as well, according to the Anatomy of an Episode extra on the Season 1 Blu-ray. Joffrey is sincerely sorry and really does want Sansa to be his lady, at least for now. Up north, Theon is riding around on a horse when he comes across Ros on the back of a turnip cart. She says she's heading to White Harbour to take a ship to King's Landing. Theon asks how she can afford that, and she tells him some of her clients are pretty generous compared to others. Theon points out there's 1,000 girls like Ros in King's Landing, and she retorts she'll have lots of company then. He admits she'll be pretty popular until she gets her teeth knocked out by a fat lord who can't get his tiny pecker up. She chuckles and asks if she stayed, would Theon marry her and make her Lady Greyjoy, mistress of the Iron Islands, but he tells her not to be a fool. She says she's heard of Jaime's attack on Ned, and that all, or at least most of the men, will soon be marching off to war, and less men means less business for her, so she's leaving. She tells the cart driver, Stefan, to set off again, and as they're riding away from Theon, he shouts for her to let him see something one last time. She says see what, and he quickly digs out a coin and tosses it to her. She catches it, then laughing lifts up her clothes to flash him her jingo. He calls he's going to miss her, and she answers back she knows. Apparently Ross's last name is Solo. In King's Landing, in the Hand's chambers, Ned tells Arya and Sansa that he's sending them both back home to Winterfell. Sansa says he can't send her away because of Joffrey, and Arya says he can't because she's starting to get good with training with Syrio, and asks if he's sending them away because his leg is literally killing him. He says he isn't dying, and he's not sending them away as a punishment, but for their own safety. Arya asks if Syrio can come with them, but Sansa says who cares about some dumb dancing teacher. In the book, when Arya asks this, Ned does actually say that if Syrio agreed to enter his service, then he can come as well. He might not do so well in the cold though. Sansa argues she can't go because she's supposed to marry Joffrey. She loves him and will be his queen and have his babies. To that, Arya Sweven Hells and I agree, vomit-inducing. Ned says when she's old enough he'll find a better match for her, someone who's brave and gentle and strong. Not realising what she's saying, she says she doesn't want someone brave and gentle and strong, she wants Joffrey, making Arya and Ned chuckle. She believes he'll be a great king, a golden lion, and she'll give him lots of children with blonde hair. This gets the cogs in Ned's brain turning as Arya calls her sister an idiot, because Joffrey's not a Lannister lion but a Baratheon Baratheon stag like his father, but Sansa says he's nothing like drunk old King Robert. Ned tells them both to go find Sector Mordain and start packing their things. Sansa still wants to argue, but Arya grabs her arm and drags her from the room as Ned sits down at his desk. He opens the ponderous old tome to the page of House Baratheon. He reads out several of their names: Lord Orys Baratheon, founder of House Baratheon, best friend, champion and possibly bastard half-brother to Aegon Targaryen I, black of hair. Axel Baratheon, a show creation and black of hair. Lionel Baratheon, the laughing storm and head of House Baratheon during the reign of King Aegon Targaryen V, black of hair. Steffon Baratheon, father of Robert, Stannis and Renly, black of hair. Robert Baratheon, the drunk old king, black of hair. And finally Joffrey Baratheon, heir to the throne, golden haired. This implies that every Baratheon child should be born with black hair, and if one isn't, then infidelity has occurred on the woman's part so long as she isn't a Baratheon. Robert's daughter Barra, by the light-haired whore Megan, is described as having fine dark hair and resembles another one of Robert's bastards, Maya Stone, who also has dark hair when she was a baby. Let's also not forget about the black-haired Gendry, whose mother was a tavern wench with yellow hair, and it appears the Baratheon's gene for black hair dominates all. However, in the book, what research Ned does with the ponderous tome is just to see what hair all the offspring had of previous Baratheon to Lannister couplings. 9 years ago, Tyr Lannister and Gawain Baratheon had a son with black hair that died in infancy, and 30 years before that, a male Lannister and female Baratheon had a son and 3 daughters, all of them with black hair. The same every other mating of the stag and the lion. Always the gold yielded to the coal. Ned realises Joffrey is not the son of Robert Baratheon. In place of a head of black hair, instead he has a golden crown, a Lannister crown. At Vaes Dothrak, a feast is being held with lots of food, booby dancing, laughing and music. Viserys stumbles in drunk, asking random Dothraki, who probably don't even speak the common tongue, where his whore sister is. Dany, having noticed her brother, tells Jorah to go and stop him. Jorah walks up to Viserys and makes the mistake of touching him as he slaps Jorah's hands away and tells him no one touches the dragon. Quoth says something hilarious in Dothraki that makes Drogo and several others laugh, and Viserys overhears and calls to Drogo, saying he's here for the feast. Drogo speaks in Dothraki and points to the back of the tent, and Jorah translates that Drogo says Viserys' place is back there, amongst the dregs of the gathered Dothraki. Viserys argues that in the back in the shadows is no place for a king, and Drogo answers that Viserys isn't a king. Furious, he draws his sword, pointing it at Jorah, telling him to keep away as the music stops and all the Dothraki glare at him. Dany calls to him and he points his sword from Jorah to her and approaches her. Jorah pleads for him to lower his sword or they'll be killed, but Viserys, waving his sword about, points out to the other rule of Vaes Dothrak, besides not carrying a weapon, is that no blood is allowed to be spilled. Doria tries to stand in the way of Dany and Viserys' sword, but Dany pushes her away. Pointing his sword at Dany's belly, Viserys says though the Dothraki can't spill blood, he can, and pushes Dany back down to her seat with his sword. He retranslates for Drogo as Viserys tells his sister he wants the crown Drogo promised him, that he bought Dany but never paid, and if he doesn't he'll take Dany back, cutting the child out of her to leave for him. Drogo speaks and Dany translates when Viserys asks what he's saying, that he agrees, and will give him a golden crown that men shall tremble to behold. Looking happy and if he is about to cry, Viserys lowers his sword and says that's all he wanted. Drogo walks up to Dany, puts his hand on her belly, then gives an order in Dothraki. Quotho and another grab Viserys' arms from behind, Quotho breaking the one holding the sword and falls him to his knees as he screams that they cannot touch him and that he wants his crown. Ordering a pot of soup emptied, Drogo drops a belt of gold medallions into it. Viserys looks at his sister terrified as Jorah approaches her, urging her to look away, but she refuses. Calling his sister Dany, Viserys pleads for her to make them stop, but she remains silent as Drogo picks up the pot of melted gold and standing before Viserys says, "A crown for a king," then proceeds to pour it over his head. Drogo kneels and stares into Viserys' face as the gold pours down and it hardens incredibly quickly, killing him. Dany, creepily calm, says Viserys was no dragon as fire cannot kill a dragon. That's not entirely true there, Dany, though they are quite fire resistant. Plenty of dragons died in the Doom of Valyria when the 14 flames erupted, plus their eyes can be burned as we know from when Moondancer was blinded by Sunfire's flames during the Dance of the Dragons. And as well as actual dragons, plenty of Targaryens in the past have died from regular fire and dragon fire to boot. In any case, that's the end of the episode. So, that was the 6th episode of the first season of Game of Thrones titled A Golden Crown, and it was a trial-heavy episode, with Theon mentioning the Iron Islands trial of killing your first enemy to become a man, Robert's mention of the trial of making the 8 to become a real man, Dany's trial of eating a raw horse's heart so her son will grow to be a strong man, trial by combat between Bronn and Vardis, last man standing wins. In conclusion, I put this episode in the rank of good, with my favourite part going to Viserys, not his death, but the character of Viserys as a whole in this episode. He's a cruel man, but he's also tragic, forced from a young age to provide for himself and his sister, sacrificing his pride and honour to beg to survive. Filled with bitterness towards those that destroyed his family and hardened by a harsh childhood, he became an angry, cruel person devoid of love, using fear to control his sister. Then, when he sees how much the Dothraki love her, how he can no longer intimidate her, how she has now risen above him, he breaks. First, he tries to flee with the dragon eggs, abandoning his sister to try and find another way to retake Westeros, but he's thwarted by Jorah, who has switched his allegiance from him to Dany. If this exiled knight won't even keep to the oaths he made to him, what hope does he have that others would? And finally, after drinking liquid courage, he approaches Dany and Drogo to demand what he is owed. Even the book says it was the saddest thing for Dany to remember, how Viserys smiled when he believed he was finally going to get his crown, only to die horribly. A short-lived but great character. My most disliked part of the episode goes to the Eyrie. The moon door being a hole in the floor is a cool concept, but it just doesn't make any sense. The terrible redesign of what should be, as Tyrion has said, the most impregnable castle in the Seven Kingdoms. Ugly ass termite mound. Thank you all so much for watching. If you have any advice on what I could do better for the next video, please leave it in a comment below. Next time we'll be covering the 7th episode of the first season of Game of Thrones titled You Win or You Die, so don't forget to like, subscribe and comment, even if it's just to say not today. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Goodbye.